did you serve?
No war.
Sorry, go ahead.
I served from 1960 to 1962, so it was totally at peacetime.
What was your branch of service?
I was a member of the U.S. Navy Nurse Corps.
Your highest rank?
Lieutenant, junior grade.
In what locations generally did you serve?
The basic training at Newport, Rhode Island, and where we went through an officer training program, and then the remainder of my service was at St. Albans Naval Hospital on Long Island in New York.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
Where were you living at the time?
I was a student at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My family resided in Washington, Pennsylvania.
Do you remember the day that you enlisted?
It was, for me, it wasn't a certain day. As I remember, the application process took several weeks. In that I joined the Navy as part of a special program that they ran to recruit nurses. And you would apply, and if you were accepted, they actually paid you enlisted rank while you were in school, and at the completion of your, and you had to be in a bachelor's program, collegiate school of nursing. So I started that whole process sometime around January or February of my final year, 1960. And everything was finalized as of March. So from March 1960 through August, I was still a student, but I was paid this basic rank. And there was some tuition support for some of the girls. And as I remember, my families did not accept the tuition, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm not sure. And it was a rather unique program in that 5 of us from our class joined together. And we went to our first assignment all together, too.
Why did you join service?
I was graduating and thinking about what I was going to do in the future. My friends were already joining the Navy, and some of them had already been accepted and were part of the program. So that's when I first learned about it. And I thought, I could do this, which sounded interesting, or I can just stay in Pittsburgh and get a job in a hospital and find an apartment and live in Pittsburgh. Well, the idea of joining the Navy sounded a lot more interesting and exciting. And my father had been a member in the Navy during World War II. So I had grown up listening to all these tales of the service and the Navy, and he was always very proud of his service, and also some close family friends were also in the Navy. And I just, from my childhood could remember all these tales that these men would tell about as far as their service. So the Navy was a perfect fit for me.
What were your first days in the service like?
Well, our first days in the service, after we were commissioned at graduation, they put together this special ceremony, and it was done mainly for publicity. And I understand, I later learned from Miss Gormish, who's the person who recruited me, that for several years after that, there were quite a few students from Duquesne who did just as we did. But we were the first ones, and so they had a lot of publicity, and they had this special ceremony at the graduation where we actually changed into our uniforms and were commissioned. We then were allowed, as I remember, it was 4 weeks leave. We had the month of August off, and then the 5 of us boarded a plane for Providence, Rhode Island, and went to Newport for, so I remember the school was about 8 weeks. But that I actually have the invitation, so that's one way to sneak. Okay, graduation was the 18th of November, and if we started in early September, so I'll give you an idea how long it was. And you take all the courses, military justice, ships, aircrafts, and weapons, and so forth. So I remember that as being a lot of very, very hard work, but also we had a lot of fun. Then, and also in the middle of this, the 5 of us had to fly back to Pennsylvania and take our boards. So that was rather unique because here we weren't able to study for our boards for nursing because we were, the 5 of us, all involved in this other school where we were having to take tests and learn all sorts of things. But then we had a few days off from that, and then we reported for duty to St. Albans.
Well, how did it feel being a member of the Navy?
I felt a special sense of pride in it. And, I really enjoyed my whole time in the Navy.
Did it feel any different after you first joined? Did it feel...
Well, the thing is, you're growing as you're in there. So, yes, definitely you feel different.
What was your training like, really? So, going through, I guess, school, and then they trained you all at St. Albans.
Well, it's so many years ago. I mean, I told you a little bit about the experience at Newport and learning how to march and in formation. And I remember we had to pass and review and halfway through the whole process. And I happened to be the company commander for the passing and review. So I was the one out there calling out all the commands for that. And I was a nervous wreck about that. But you really grew as a person because they put you under pressure. I made the mistake of, they told us that everyone had to take swimming. And I made the mistake of telling them I was an advanced swimmer, not knowing what that really meant. Well, that meant you got thrown into a senior life-saving course. And that was an experience too, in trying to complete all the requirements for that with all the laps. And I got in pretty good physical shape during that. And then once going to St. Albans, I was assigned to the surgical officers floor. So there were there was a medical officers floor and a surgical officers floor. And looking back on it now, they were pretty plum assignments. And so I really got a lot out of that too. And surgical nursing from that point on became one of my main loves. I also worked for a period of time in the intensive care unit. I was the relief nurse for the recovery room. So, and then in my second year, I left the surgical officers unit and worked more for the eye ward and the urology ward, and that's when I met my husband.
Back in training, do you remember any of your instructors at all?
You know, I remember that senior life-saving instructor. Other than that, because he jumped in the water and you had to pull him out at the end. But you know, I don't. And I remember, but I can't, I don't know her name, but there was one nurse who she was the one that was responsible for teaching us how to put makeup on and, you know, proper manners as a Navy nurse and so forth. And I just remember her as being sort of, she didn't have much of a sense of humor, let me put it that way. Other than that, I really can't tell you any of those instructors. It's like a blank.
How'd you get through training? Was it difficult? Did you have to do anything especially through it?
Well, you mean the training in the Navy?
Right.
Nothing special. I mean, it was all learning all the various procedures that you have to know when you're going to be working in any hospital. Now, the most unique person I ever met in the Navy was my first head nurse. And I definitely remember her name is Commander Christopher. And she was a redhead, and she had a temper to match. And she was really a hard taskmaster for the ward itself. So she could be pretty hard on us. And you could always tell if there'd been a period of time where she realized she'd been a little too hard on us. She'd show up at work with a cheesecake. And I remember, I guess she must have been leaving, but before she left, I asked her if I could have the recipe for the cheesecake, and she gave it to me. And it's been part of my, it became one of my specialties as I moved on. And when people would ask me for the recipe, I would always give it out, but they had to write it as Mrs. Christopher's cheesecake. So.
Where did you go, I guess, after boot camp or your first training?
That was the St. Albans. And then that was my only, because I only stayed in 2 years. And then I was discharged.
What were your first impressions upon getting to St. Albans?
How big it was. And I don't know if my husband told you, but we went back years later. Both of us went back, walked in this main lobby, and had this sense of how small it is. And so I think that's, it'll give you an example of, you know, here we were green and scared and learning things, and so it seemed to be this big, wide, huge hospital, and it wasn't. It's like, when we go back 25 years later, it's just a pretty small place, anyway.
So what was your assignment, or what were you tasked with doing at St. Albans?
Well, like I said, I was on the officer's surgical floor, and on most days there would be 2 nurses on duty, the head nurse and then a nurse under her. So as an ensign, I was always the junior nurse. Now for that second year, when I said that I was then working on in the eye ward and the urology ward, those were smaller units and would only have 1 nurse on any given day. So when I was down there, I was either working the relief for the head nurse when she was off on her days off, or I was doing the evening shifts. And the junior nurses typically would, because you would have every other weekend off. And typically what you did is had the short week with the weekend off was days. And then you would come back to work to evenings, and you'd stay on evenings through a weekend. So you'd have a long run of evenings. And evening shifts, you were the only nurse on.
What was a typical day for you at the hospital?
Oh, that's taking me back. Typical day is you go in and you get report on all the patients. Everybody sits through the morning report. And then you would come out and you make rounds on the ward, where you'd have to check in on every patient. And you're monitoring, what their status is. And there usually were corpsmen under you giving the direct care. Like, we didn't give baths or anything like that, except when we were on night duty. You would be assigned on direct patient care more. Like, I often did night duty in the intensive care unit. So there you would have 2 or 3 patients. If I was on night duty for the other units, I covered both the medical and the surgical floors. So you're more supervising the care that's being provided by the enlisted corpsmen that are under you. And you're not passing medications or that type of thing either. There's one of those on too. You do a lot of transcribing the doctor's orders and making sure that the new orders are carried out and that kind of thing.
Did anyone ever, do you know of anyone ever getting hurt, maybe lifting a patient or something, some sort of accident ever happening, and maybe one of the staff getting injured in any sort of way?
No, I don't remember at any time a staff member becoming injured. I remember one of the times I was on evenings, we had an elderly patient. He was, as I remember, he originally came in for possibly prostate surgery or something like that, but then he developed staph infections, abscesses. And between that and he just seemed to be around for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And he was quite elderly. He must have been in his 70s at the time. And one day he's out tottering down the hall, and he slipped and fell. And this happened when I was on duty. So we got him back into bed. He didn't have any obvious injuries. But wouldn't you know, you have him back into bed, and for some strange reason, the overhead light came loose from its seating and it fell right between his legs. And I'll never forget him moaning and groaning, and it never even touched him. He wasn't hurt, but that was a typical night. Or maybe it wasn't a typical night, it was an atypical night. But that was the only incident, and of course I had to write up all that in these long reports. But those are the only incidents that ever happened when I was on duty.
Were you awarded any medals or citations in the service?
No.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
I heard what Tino said. Basically the same thing, collect phone calls. And also I wrote to them once a week. And my older sister, who was married, would also write once a week. So my mother would ship her letter to me so I could read it, and she would. So I never wrote directly to my sister. She got all the news by And the same for me by getting to read the letter that we sent to our parents.
How was the food?
I don't remember much of it. The food up in Newport was awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. In fact, even with all that activity of marching and the swimming, I gained weight. I think I gained almost 10 pounds. But at St. Albans, I had a lot of my meals in the nursing quarters, where we would just have food that we bought ourselves rather than go down to the mess.
Was there any instance of maybe not being short of some sort of items in the hospital, like syringes, or I think you're usually pretty well stocked there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can't remember any problems.
How did you handle the stress or pressure put on you in the positions you were in the hospital?
How did I handle it? I don't know. You just do it. I don't remember any particular things that I did that was to handle, but you're often under stress, especially, those times when I had to work the intensive care unit. That's stressful. Those people are very, very sick. Because of that experience, I then went on and worked in an intensive care unit after I got out.
Did you do anything for good luck in these situations or anything?
Good luck?
Yeah.
No, prayed a lot. That's about it.
So how did people entertain themselves in the hospital, keep themselves busy?
I don't know. In those days, listening to TV was non-existent. There was maybe one TV out in like the solarium, deck areas. But in the rooms, you just had radios. So listening to radios.
What did you tend to do in your free time?
Drive around the Long Island or go downtown New York City. Usually just getting out and about and doing things with our friends.
Did you ever see any entertainers at all, or any of the public hospital?
We, not to the hospital. I mean, we went to some of the plays, and you could get tickets through the USO, so you could do that cheaply. So we do things like that. We went down to New Year's Eve in Times Square, the 5 of us, and had a good time.
Was that during the time of leave?
No, we we had to be on duty the next morning.
Must have been
Yeah, we were a little tired the next day.
Yeah.
Well, we got on the wrong subway going home, so we actually didn't get back to the hospital till about, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, because we got on the subway that took us north into the Bronx instead of going out to the island. Mm-hmm. So we were on the subway for over an hour.
So did you go on any leave?
I can't remember. I must have had some leave at the end of that first year, but I probably just went home and spent some time. And then when I got out, I had unused leave. So I hadn't taken leave the second year.
Do they do anything if you have unused leave?
They pay you. Yeah.
Do you recall anything else that was maybe humorous or unusual happen while you were working?
Well, we had another unique patient. His name was, maybe I shouldn't be given names under HIPAA, come to think of it. But there was a gentleman who came in for surgery. He was commander, and he didn't heal well. And so they did a repair, and that didn't heal well, and they did a repair. Well, in other words, we all got to know him quite well. In fact, it was on him that I learned how to draw blood. He knew I'd never drawn blood before, and went in and practiced on him, and he thought that was neat. But he got so frustrated with his situation of not getting better. He went AWOL one night and went downtown New York and had a high old time in the bars and got mugged and then ended up coming back safely to the hospital. But you got to know your patients because they did stay much longer than what someone stays in an acute hospital in the civilian.
Did you work in a civilian hospital afterwards?
Yeah, we got married, and I first started working in a veterans hospital. But I didn't really care for the veterans hospital, and so then started working at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, and worked there for over a year, and then I had our first child, and then after that I just worked part-time. Like he was saying, I worked weekends.
What did you find, I guess, unique, or the good things and the pros and cons about working in more of a Navy hospital like St. Albans, and then like working in civilian hospitals?
Well, they're similar because in a civilian hospital, a nurse has under her licensed practical nurses and nursing assistants who might be the one actually giving the direct patient care, whereas you're more giving treatments and passing medications and things like that. So they are similar. Yeah, he probably wants me to say, the corpsman always said, you can replace a Navy nurse with a nail on the wall. And the nail on the wall is where you hung the narcotic keys. Because that was the one unique thing. Only the nurse could carry the narcotic keys.
Not the doctor.
Well, a doctor, but they wouldn't be involved in that at all. But as far as, giving care, the nurses held on to the narcotic keys. They were the only ones that could open that up.
Mm-hmm. So what did you think of the officers or fellow people you worked with?
They were all wonderful. One big difference was, of course, you have to remember, I was coming out of a nursing school. But in those days, if doctors came into the nurses' station, you were expected to stand up and give your seat to them. And especially they didn't talk to the lowly student nurses, for heaven's sakes. But there was this clear hierarchy within the hospital. And in the Navy, it's a more collegial relationship in that the physician staff and the nursing staff interact on a more collegial basis than what I was used to seeing in the civilian hospital. But compared to what it's like today, in general, it is a more collegial relationship.
Did you keep a diary or journal or anything?
Never did.
Where were you at the end of your service?
At St. Albans. And then, I was discharged into the reserve, but then that's, it was an inactive reserve. And then when I had my first child, then I was discharged from the reserve.
What was the day like when that day you were discharged and put into the reserve?
Well, because I was going home and to get married, it was just all a very exciting time. And I remember packing up my car, and it was full of all my possessions, and driving home and just feeling very happy about that.
And did it feel any different the day you were discharged from the reserves to?
No, that was just
administrative?
Yeah. One thing I didn't mention is that I was in the Navy at the time of the Cuban crisis. So I was really scheduled to get out of the Navy early in November 1962. But then along came the Cuban crisis in October, and all Navy personnel were involuntarily extended for a full year. But then, as we know, the Cuban crisis resolved. But I did actually get out of the Navy about a month late because of that.
What was your home feeling like the day when you got back home?
Yeah, I can't really remember. I mean, it was a long drive. I was probably tired. I was probably getting home very late at night. So I don't have a picture of that in my mind at all.
What did you do in the days or weeks following coming home?
Get ready for this wedding, because it's the 28th of November, and I'm getting married the 29th of December. Plus, I had to do all the paperwork for the new job in the Veterans Hospital. I had to complete that application and everything. So I remember, doing all that paperwork and getting ready for a wedding.
And just for the record, your husband is Constantine Trahiotis.
Correct.
Did you start going to work, or did you go to school following getting out of the service?
Right after we got married, we went to Detroit, and I had this job, walked in with the veterans, and I remember I just started to work right away.
So you never went back to school, you just continued with work?
I eventually went back to school, but that was much later when we were living in Champaign. And then I went to graduate school.
And your education was not covered by the GI Bill?
No.
Did you make any close friendships in the service?
My husband. And we went in with the 5 girls. So I really didn't stay in contact with anyone, as I think I heard my husband telling you, we did reconnect with Miss Gormish because she recruited me, but it turned out she was head of I don't know if she was head of the core school or she was the lead instructor for his program. There was a time where I stayed in contact with two of the other nurses, but over the years I have lost contact with them. But we used to exchange Christmas cards and things like that.
So what did you go on to do as a career following your service?
Well, the main career was to become a mother, so that after I had our second child, I quit work. And I didn't return to work until our youngest child was going to kindergarten. But then I did start working again, at first part-time, and then gradually building up to full-time work.
And this was as a nurse?
As a nurse, most of the positions have been, I was in the staff development and education department in a hospital in Urbana, Illinois. My main position was as a patient educator, and I provided the education for people diagnosed with diabetes. I worked as the ostomy nurse for that hospital, and in general, helped plan the patient education programs throughout the hospital.
So, and then you just continue nursing that through that on. So even now, to this point, where do you?
And it kept changing, and it's through that job I went back to school and I got a master's in health education from the University of Illinois. And I left that position and started a position at another hospital as a full-time diabetes educator, and I did that for 3 years and became a certified diabetes educator. So when we moved out here, initially I wasn't able to find a position as a diabetes educator, was hired in the endocrinology department at University of Connecticut Health Center, and worked in initially the osteoporosis research department, and then ran a clinical program for women called the Osteoporosis Prevention Program. But I also got back into diabetes education and developed a program for UConn. But my whole career in nursing has been mainly then in areas of patient and health education or staff development of some sort.
How did your time, I guess, working in the hospitals through the Navy influence maybe how you look at the Navy or the military now?
Gee, I don't know how to answer that one. Feels like how I'm answering these.
No, you answer anything you want. Really. It's up to you.
I know. Honestly can't say that the Navy had any direct influence on how I practice nursing today. It's just that, my own development grew over time, and my positions changed, and that's the one thing I liked about all of my experiences, is that I was constantly being challenged to learn something new.
What specifically did you research at UConn?
Mainly osteoporosis research, but that's because I was initially hired into that program. But then I began working in what's called the Clinical Research Center, where that's where a lot of physicians funnel research through our department. And because of my past experience with diabetes, if a diabetes study came up, typically I would be assigned that. I worked, oh my goodness, it must have been at least 7 years, if not more, running the diabetes prevention program type 1, which was a big research project to see if you could identify people at risk for type 1 diabetes, not type 2. And, was there an effective intervention to delay the onset? And I really enjoyed doing that, because with that I was working with children, which is something I hadn't done for a long, long time. And having to perform procedures on children. So that was quite a challenge.
And obviously much different than working
Much different.
with naval officers.
Mm-hmm. Much different.
Did you prefer the research, or did you prefer doing clinical practice? I
think I like both of them equally. When you say clinical practice, for me now, it would be that in the educating patients. They're about equal. I find them both very challenging. And I actually enjoy paperwork, researching a project. I would be responsible for the IRB applications, for example, for these studies. So putting those together, writing the informed consent documents, that kind of thing. And I like that.
Far different than when you were at the Naval Hospital.
Yeah, a lot more paperwork.
Yeah.
Yeah, a
More
lot
people
more.
work there.
Hmm?
More people work at the hospital, the Naval Hospital?
No.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
in the research area. Lots of paperwork. In fact, toward the end, it was becoming, what with HIPAA and all the regulations coming in research. And I became certified as a it's called clinical research professional, but that was another certification I got.
Did you join any veteran organizations?
No.
Mm-mm. Or have you attended any reunions?
No. Mm-mm.
How did your service or the experiences around your service affect, your life?
Well, I think as far as my nursing practice, I think the 2 years spent as an officer and the responsibilities that you have in directing people and helped me throughout my career in nursing.
Did you receive any special honors or any achievements throughout your career?
Well, when I retired from the University of Connecticut Health Center, you have to remember, I designed the diabetes education program at the University of Connecticut Health Center. They didn't have one in place until they started the program under me. And I was retiring, and another nurse had already taken over the program itself. And I was appointed a member of what's called the steering committee for the diabetes education program. So at the time of my retirement, they invited me to a meeting of this committee, and they gave me a plaque thanking me for my service to the diabetes education program at the University of Connecticut Health Center. And then they also had a second plaque made that they said was going to be placed in the education room for the program, designating the room as the Margaret Trahiotis educational room. So that was quite an honor.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your service and for spending the time with us today, sharing your story.
Well, thank you very much.
Well done.